She didn't hesitate. Rebecca Walsh's hand shot out across the aisle of Monarch Airlines Flight 557, and the crack of her palm against James Wilson's face silenced every single person on that plane. Not a cough, not a whisper, just the hum of engines 37,000 feet above the ground, and the slow, terrible realization spreading across 214 passengers that something had just happened that could not be undone. She stood there, chest heaving, chin lifted, absolutely certain she was in the right. She had no idea who she had just touched. She had no idea what she had just started. If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to our channel, follow every single part of this story until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. James Wilson had not slept in 31 hours. That was the first thing anyone needed to understand about the man sitting in seat 24B on Monarch Airlines Flight 557 out of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport bound for Seattle-Tacoma. Not the badge concealed beneath his jacket, not the federal credentials folded inside his left breast pocket, not the service weapon secured at his hip under a loose gray Henley that had seen better days. The first thing was the exhaustion, deep structural, the kind that settled into your bones like concrete and made even the simple act of blinking feel like a negotiation with your own body. He had spent 11 days in Qatar on a protective detail that he would never be permitted to discuss in full. He had eaten bad food, slept in short, violent bursts on cots that seemed designed specifically to prevent recovery, and had spent the last 72 hours in a state of what his supervisor liked to call elevated operational awareness, which was a polished way of saying that James Wilson had not truly relaxed in over a week. His eyes had been scanning exits, tracking movement, calculating distances and threats and response windows for so long that the behavior had stopped feeling like work and started feeling like breathing. So when he settled into the middle seat of row 24, wedged between a heavy-set man in a Notre Dame sweatshirt who was already asleep and a teenage girl with noise-canceling headphones who had not looked up from her phone since boarding, James allowed himself something he rarely permitted on duty. He allowed himself to be still. He pressed his head back against the seat. He closed his eyes. He told himself he would be in Seattle in 5 hours. He told himself he would see his daughter Maya, who was 12 now, and had started sending him voice messages instead of texts, because she said she wanted to hear his reaction in real time when she told him things. He had 17 of those unlistened voice messages saved on his phone. He planned to listen to every single one the moment this plane touched down. He was almost asleep when he heard the voice. It cut through the ambient noise of the cabin the way a fire alarm cuts through music. Not loud exactly, but with a particular frequency designed to be impossible to ignore. Sharp, clipped, carrying the unmistakable edge of someone who had decided before the day even started that they were not going to be patient. "Ma'am, I need you to sit down. This is not a suggestion." James did not open his eyes immediately. He had learned over years of fieldwork that the first few seconds of any developing situation were often more informative when processed through sound alone. He listened. "We are trying," a woman's voice, younger, strained, the particular timbre of someone working hard to keep their composure. "The bag is just a little big and we're trying to—" "It's too big. It needs to go underneath the seat or it needs to be checked. Those are your options." "We already checked one bag. We just need 1 more minute. You have had 3 minutes. Other passengers are trying to get to their seats." James opened his eyes. 4 rows ahead and across the aisle, a young woman, she couldn't have been more than 26, 27, was wrestling with a diaper bag that had gotten wedged awkwardly in the overhead bin. Beside her, a man about the same age was holding an infant against his chest, with one arm using his free hand to try to help with the bag, his movements hampered by the baby, who had started to fuss, and was now making the particular sound that meant escalation was approximately 90 seconds away. They were flustered. They were embarrassed. And they were being spoken to in a tone that James had only ever heard used in interrogation rooms. The flight attendant was a white woman, somewhere in her mid-40s, with her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to be contributing to her expression. Her name tag read Rebecca. She stood in the aisle with her arms crossed and her weight shifted back onto one hip, and she was looking at the young couple the way a principal looks at a student who has already used up every last reserve of goodwill. I'm going to need you to make a decision, Rebecca said. Right now. We're trying, the young father said, and there was something in his voice, a careful steadiness, the voice of a man who was very aware of how he would be perceived if he raised it, that made James sit up straighter. Just give us 1 second, please. Sir, you are holding up the boarding process for everyone on this plane. Our baby is not my concern right now. Getting these passengers seated is my concern. The baby started to cry. James was out of his seat before he had consciously decided to move. It was muscle memory, the same reflex that had once gotten him across a terminal in Rome in under 4 seconds when he spotted a man reaching into his coat near a crowded gate. His body simply resolved the situation before his mind finished processing it. He was up, he was moving, and he reached the overhead bin in the time it took Rebecca to draw breath for her next sentence. Here, he said quietly, addressing the young father. Let me help you with that. He reached up, angled the bag with a quick, practiced adjustment. The geometry of overhead bins was something he had worked out years ago, a small professional skill that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with having taken several hundred flights, and the bag settled into place with a soft, final click. The young mother looked at him with the particular relief of someone who had been drowning and just felt the ground beneath their feet. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you so much." "Of course," James said. He was turning back toward his seat when Rebecca's voice stopped him. "Sir." He turned. She was looking at him the way people sometimes looked at him in situations like this, a particular kind of assessment that he had learned to read with precision after decades of experiencing it, a look that calculated and categorized and arrived at conclusions that had nothing to do with what was actually in front of them. He held her gaze steadily. "That was not your place," she said. "I was just helping them with their bag," James said. His voice was level, quiet enough that only she could hear it, which was a deliberate choice. "Passengers are not permitted to interfere with crew management of the cabin. If you have a concern, you can speak with me privately." "I don't have a concern," he said. "I helped someone put a bag in an overhead bin, that's all." Something shifted in her expression, a narrowing, a tightening. He had seen that look before, too. It was the look of someone who had decided that calmness in this moment was itself a form of aggression. "I need you to return to your seat," she said. "Now." "I'm returning to my seat," he said, and began to do exactly that. "I'm not finished speaking to you." He paused, turned back. "I'm sorry. You interfered with my management of this cabin. That is a violation of federal aviation regulations, and I have the authority to have you removed from this aircraft." The cabin had gone quiet in that particular way that happens when people stop pretending not to listen. James was aware of it the way conversation in the surrounding rows had simply stopped, the way heads had angled slightly without fully turning. He kept his own voice at a steady, even pitch, not loud, not heated. "I understand you're frustrated," he said. "I'm not trying to cause a problem. I was helping a family with their bag. I'm happy to return to my seat." "Your attitude is a problem. I haven't raised my voice once. Your tone? Rebecca." He said her name simply, without edge. "I'm going to sit down now." He turned away. What happened next took approximately 1.5 seconds. He heard the sharp intake of breath behind him, not a gasp, not an exclamation, but the precise sound of someone moving, and then the force of it palm flat, connecting with the left side of his face, hard enough to snap his head to the right and produce a crack that carried with perfect acoustic clarity through the entire cabin. Time did something strange. It didn't stop. James had experienced enough high-stress events to know that the movie version of time stopping was largely a myth, but it compressed the way time does when the body dumps adrenaline into the bloodstream all at once, and everything becomes hyper-sharp and hyper-slow simultaneously. He felt the sting across his cheekbone. He felt his jaw tighten. He felt his heart rate spike, and then with the same deliberate discipline that had gotten him through 11 days in Qatar and a career spanning 2 decades, he felt himself choose. He did not turn around fast. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anything at his hip. He stood very still for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, he did something Rebecca Walsh would not understand until it was far too late. He decided exactly how this was going to go. When he turned, she was still standing with her hand slightly raised, as if her own body hadn't fully processed what it had just done. Her expression was a complicated collision of fury and something else, something that looked, if you watched closely enough, like the very first flicker of fear. The kind that comes not from what someone does in response to you, but from the absolute stillness of them choosing not to. Around them, the cabin was a held breath, 214 people collectively suspended. "Do not touch me again," James said. His voice was so quiet that the woman in the window seat 2 rows back would later tell investigators she had to read his lips to confirm he had spoken at all. But every person within 6 rows heard it. The quality of a voice can carry independent of volume. This one carried weight, deliberate, precise, irrevocable weight. Rebecca's chin came up. "You were—" "Do not touch me again," he repeated. "Exactly the same volume, exactly the same tone. That is the only thing I am going to say to you right now. You will sit down or I will have— You have just committed a federal offense." Still quiet, still level. "I would like you to think about that before you say anything else." The word federal landed in the cabin like a stone in still water, and James watched the rings expand outward in real time, the slight stiffening in the row beside him. The whispered exchange 4 rows back, a man across the aisle who had been watching the whole exchange, reaching slowly for his phone. Rebecca blinked. Her chin was still up, but something had shifted beneath it. "Excuse me." "You heard me," James said. He was not going to say it again. He reached calmly into his jacket slowly, deliberately, the way a man who carries a weapon learns to reach for anything in public, and produced a flat, dark credential wallet. He opened it with one hand and held it at a height that was just right for her eyes. The badge caught the overhead light of the cabin. Federal Air Marshal Service, United States Department of Homeland Security, and beside it, a photograph that matched the man standing in front of her with absolute and devastating precision. Rebecca Walsh went still. Not the dramatic, cinematic stillness of someone who has received a shocking revelation. The real kind. The kind where the body's systems momentarily pause because the brain is performing a rapid, urgent recalculation and does not have processing power to spare for anything else. Her face did not crumple. Her eyes did not fill. She simply went very, very quiet. And in that quiet, you could see the exact moment that everything she had believed about the last 10 minutes reorganized itself into something she was not prepared for. The man in the Notre Dame sweatshirt, who had been startled awake by the slap, was leaning into the aisle with his mouth slightly open. The teenage girl with the noise-canceling headphones had pulled one ear free and was staring. The young father, still holding his now quieted infant, was watching James with an expression that James would think about for a long time afterward, not just surprise but something deeper. Recognition. A kind of exhale. "My name," James said, still quiet, still controlled, "is Senior Air Marshal James Wilson. I am a federal law enforcement officer. You have just committed battery against a federal officer in the performance of his duty. I need you to step back, and I need you to stay calm because what happens in the next few minutes is going to matter a great deal." Rebecca's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I didn't know." "That is something you can explain later. Right now, I need you to step back." She stepped back. The cabin exhaled. James held the badge for another 3 seconds, then folded it and returned it to his jacket. He turned slowly and looked down the length of the cabin. People were watching him from every direction, some openly, some pretending they weren't, some with phones discreetly angled in ways they probably thought were subtle. He had been trained to ignore this. He did not feel comfortable with it. Those were 2 different things, and they could coexist. He moved to the front of the coach section, where a second flight attendant, a younger woman, early 30s, with a name tag that said Carla, was standing near the galley with wide eyes and a deeply uncertain expression, as if she was trying to determine whether what she had just witnessed was something she needed to act on or something she was going to pretend had not happened. "I need to speak with your captain," James said. Carla didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir, right away." She moved toward the cockpit with the walk of someone who was grateful to have a direction to go. James stood where he was. Behind him, he could hear Rebecca beginning to speak to another passenger who had asked her something, and he heard the tight, fragile quality in her voice that he recognized as the sound of someone whose internal narrative was collapsing in real time. The teenage girl in 24C leaned into the aisle and said quietly to no one in particular, "Did he just say he's a federal marshal?" "Air Marshal," the man in the Notre Dame sweatshirt said. He was fully awake now. He had the look of a man who had a story to tell for the rest of his life and was already composing the opening line. 4 rows back, a retired schoolteacher named Gloria Hutchins, who had been watching the entire exchange from her window seat with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 32 years reading rooms full of people, reached into her carry-on and retrieved a small notebook. She opened it to a fresh page. She uncapped her pen. She wrote the time. She had a feeling she was going to need to remember the details. The PA system crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Dana Kim speaking from the flight deck. We are aware of a situation in the cabin and are taking appropriate steps. We ask all passengers to please remain seated and calm. We appreciate your patience and cooperation." The words were carefully chosen. Airlines train for this. The language was designed to be soothing without being informative, to acknowledge without alarming, to reassure without revealing. But 214 people on Monarch Airlines Flight 557 were not calmed by it because 214 people had just watched a flight attendant slap a passenger across the face, and that passenger had turned out to be a federal officer, and no amount of First Officer Dana Kim's careful PA phrasing was going to make any of them unsee that. The buzz in the cabin started low and built steadily. James could feel it behind him, the particular pressure of a collective that was actively processing something and talking while it did. He stood near the galley, and he thought about Maya's 17 unlistened voice messages, and he thought about the cot in Qatar, and he thought about the overhead bin and the young family and the baby who had stopped crying the moment the bag was secured, as if the resolution of that small logistical problem had been the most important thing in the world. Which to that baby it probably had been. Carla came back from the direction of the cockpit. Her expression had changed. She looked at James the way people sometimes looked at him when they understood the full weight of what was in his jacket pocket. Not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness. A recalibration. "Captain Morrison would like to speak with you, sir. He's asking if you can come forward." "I can," James said. He followed Carla toward the front of the plane, and as he passed row after row, he felt the weight of every pair of eyes that tracked his movement. He did not look at them. He looked ahead. He had learned over a career that had taken him to 17 countries and into more situations than he was licensed to fully describe, that the moment you look around to see who is watching you, you have already given something away. He was not going to give anything away. Behind him in the space between rows 18 and 20, Rebecca Walsh was standing with one hand on the back of a seat and the other pressed flat against her stomach, and she was beginning to understand, not completely, not yet, but in the way that comprehension sometimes arrives before emotion does exactly what she had done. She was beginning to understand that the 10 seconds between reaching her hand out and feeling it connect had not been authority reasserting itself, had not been a bad day boiling over, had not been anything that any explanation, any context, any version of events that she could construct would make defensible or survivable. She was beginning to understand that she had made a mistake of a kind that does not offer second chances. And 37,000 feet below them, Atlanta was already behind them, and Seattle was 5 hours away, and somewhere over the brown and green patchwork of Middle America, a federal case was beginning to assemble itself with the quiet, unstoppable efficiency of a system that had been designed to do exactly this. The cockpit door opened. James stepped through. Captain Roy Morrison was not a man who showed surprise easily. 31 years in commercial aviation had given him the particular kind of face that processed incoming information with minimal external display, the same way a well-built dam processes water. Everything goes through. Nothing spills. He was 58 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and the careful, deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades understanding that in a metal tube traveling at 570 miles per hour, the body language of the person in charge matters more than almost anything else. He looked at James for a long moment after James stepped through the cockpit door. First Officer Dana Kim was still in her seat. her hands resting on the controls with the neutral readiness of someone who had been told to stay put and had excellent reasons to do exactly that. The cockpit was small and precise and smelled like coffee and recycled air, and it was the first place James had felt genuinely comfortable since boarding. Morrison extended his hand. "Marshal Wilson." James shook it. "Captain." Dana briefed me on what she saw from the galley. Morrison's voice was measured, but James had spent enough time reading people to catch the thing underneath it. A contained fury, the kind that belongs to a man who has built his professional life around order, and has just been told that something profoundly disorderly has occurred on his airplane. "I need to hear it from you directly." "Your flight attendant and coach Rebecca Walsh struck me across the face with an open palm. I had intervened to assist a passenger family with their carry-on. She objected. I was returning to my seat when she made physical contact." Morrison was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "You're certain of the sequence?" "I'm certain of every detail. I've been trained to be." "You identified yourself afterward?" "Immediately after the contact, yes." Morrison turned away from James and looked through the windscreen at the particular blue-gray of cruising altitude, and James watched the captain's jaw work once, just once, in the way jaws do when a man is choosing between what he wants to say and what he needs to say. Morrison chose correctly. "She's been with the airline 14 years, he said, not as a defense, as information, as if he was still cataloging the full weight of what had just occurred. "I understand," James said. "That doesn't change what happened." "No, it doesn't." Morrison turned back. "What do you need from me?" "I need her separated from the passengers for the remainder of the flight. I need you to radio ahead to Seattle-Tacoma. TSA local law enforcement airline security. I want a full response ready when we land. And I need whatever this airline's standard protocol is for in-flight incidents involving federal officers to be activated right now if it hasn't been already." Morrison nodded once, the nod of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew was going to be necessary. "Dana," he said it without raising his voice. "Already pulling the protocol checklist, Captain," Dana Kim said from her seat. She had not turned around. She had anticipated the need and moved toward it before being asked, which told James something useful about her. "One more thing," James said. Morrison looked at him. "The passengers filmed it. At least 3 that I saw, possibly more. That footage is already on those phones, and it is going to leave this aircraft one way or another. I need you to be aware of that when you're deciding how to document this internally, because the airline's version of events and the visual record need to be consistent with each other. If they're not, that becomes a second problem on top of the first one." Morrison held James's gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. "You've done this before." "Had a flight attendant hit me? No. Had situations develop in ways that required managing multiple simultaneous consequences more times than I can count." Morrison almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but the intention was there. "All right, Marshal, we'll do this your way. Go back to your seat. I'll handle Walsh personally." James returned to the cabin. The atmosphere had changed in the time he'd been forward. It had the particular charge of a space in which people have been actively talking and have just collectively decided to appear as though they haven't. Conversations stopped mid-syllable as he walked back through. Eyes went to phones, to windows, to the seatback screens playing muted movies. He walked steadily, unhurried, and he took his seat between the Notre Dame sweatshirt and the teenager, and he settled back and he looked at the ceiling of the aircraft, and he thought 5 more hours. The man in the Notre Dame sweatshirt, who had introduced himself at some point in the last 20 minutes as Phil, a sales rep from Columbus on his way to a trade show, he'd been dreading, leaned toward James with the barely contained energy of someone sitting on a story they desperately needed to tell. "So," Phil said, keeping his voice low in the way that people keep their voices low when they want to appear discreet while being entirely the opposite. "Federal Air Marshal, huh?" "That's right," James said. "I didn't know they actually, I knew they existed, but I thought it was more of a—" Phil paused, searching for the word. "More of a symbolic thing." "It's not a symbolic thing." "No," Phil said, with the tone of a man who had just had something confirmed that he would be recounting in considerable detail at the trade show he'd been dreading. "No, I can see that. I can see." In the row ahead and across the aisle, Gloria Hutchins had filled 2 pages of her notebook. She wrote with the focused economy of a woman who had spent 3 decades reducing classroom chaos to manageable terms, and what she had written was a precise time-stamped sequential account of everything she had observed from her window seat. She was not writing it for herself. She was writing it because it had occurred to her with the instinctive clarity that comes from having spent a career in institutions that there would be a moment when a written record would matter, and she wanted to be prepared. She had also taken 2 photographs. She was not proud of this exactly, but she was not ashamed of it either. She was practical. She had always been practical. 3 rows behind James, a man named Derek Okafor, 29, a software engineer from Atlanta who had been flying back to Seattle after visiting his parents, had done what most 29-year-old software engineers do when something extraordinary happens in front of them. He had recorded it. Not the slap itself, he hadn't had time to react, but everything after. He had footage of James displaying his badge. He had footage of Rebecca Walsh's face in the moment the credential wallet opened. He had footage of the cabin in the still suspended seconds that followed. Derek was not a dramatic person. He was methodical and precise, and he had a habit of thinking 3 steps ahead, which was why he did not immediately post anything to social media. Instead, he airdropped the video to himself, twice belt and suspenders, and he sat very quietly in his seat, thinking about what he was holding and what it might mean, and what the right thing to do with it was. He had not reached a conclusion by the time Captain Morrison's voice came over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. As you may be aware, we had a situation in the main cabin a short while ago that required my attention. I want to assure you that the situation is being managed and that the safety and security of this flight remain my absolute priority. A crew member has been removed from active service for the remainder of this flight, and we are in contact with the appropriate authorities at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. We appreciate your patience and understanding. If any of you were directly involved in or witnessed the incident and have not yet been spoken to by a crew member, I'd ask that you make yourself known to our remaining flight attendants. Thank you." The PA clicked off. The cabin exploded, not loudly, not dramatically, but in every row simultaneously conversations ignited and merged and built on each other with the speed of something that had been waiting for permission to exist. Phil leaned back toward James with an expression of profound vindication, as if the captain's announcement had confirmed something Phil had known all along. "They pulled her off duty," Phil said. "Sounds like it," James said. "Is she what happens to her now? Like, does she get arrested when we land?" James looked at him calmly. "I'm not going to speculate about that. But theoretically, Phil, yeah. I'm going to close my eyes for a while." Phil nodded rapidly. "Right, yes, absolutely, sorry." James did not actually sleep. He would have liked to. His body was running on reserves that were thinning by the hour, and the adrenaline spike from the confrontation had left him with the particular post-surge heaviness that always followed a weight behind the eyes, a slight looseness in the hands. But his mind would not stand down. It kept running the sequence. It kept arriving at the same place. She had hit him, not in the heat of a physical confrontation, not in self-defense, not by accident. She had made a decision in a moment of anger to physically strike another person on a commercial aircraft at cruising altitude. And the person she had struck had been a federal officer who was on duty, who had done nothing that warranted any response beyond an apology, and perhaps a moment of professional self-reflection. He was not angry. He had been asked many times across his career how it felt to encounter situations like this, situations loaded with the particular kind of dismissal that he had navigated his entire adult life, and his honest answer had always confounded people who expected something simpler. He was not angry. Anger was a luxury. Anger required a kind of engagement with the situation that he had learned early and hard to withhold. What he felt instead was something more sustainable and more precise. He felt clear. He felt certain. He felt the exact kind of focused resolve that comes from knowing with total confidence that every next step belongs to you. Carla, the remaining active flight attendant in coach, made her way through the cabin. She was working twice as hard as normal covering Rebecca's section in addition to her own, and she was doing it with a professionalism that James noticed and respected. She had not asked him a single unnecessary question. She had not inserted herself into the situation beyond what was required of her. When she reached his row, she stopped. "Marshal Wilson, can I get you anything water coffee?" "Water would be great. Thank you, Carla." She was back in under a minute with a full bottle and a small package of pretzels that she set on his tray without ceremony. He accepted them with genuine gratitude, and she moved on. 2 rows forward, the young couple James had learned in the moments after the badge reveal that their names were Anthony and Simone Carter, and that the baby was named Elijah, and that they were moving to Seattle for Anthony's new job at a logistics company, were speaking quietly to each other. Simone was nursing Elijah with a blanket draped over her shoulder, and Anthony had one hand on her knee and was looking at James's row with an expression that was hard to fully categorize. James had seen variations of it before. It was the look of someone processing a debt they hadn't known they were accumulating until it was paid. Anthony caught James's eye and held it for a moment. Then he nodded, just once. The small, serious nod of one man acknowledging another across the particular kind of distance that words would have made smaller, but also somehow less. James nodded back. Then the forward lavatory door opened, and what emerged from it changed the temperature of the entire section in an instant. Rebecca Walsh had clearly been crying. Not the dramatic visible collapse of someone who has lost control. Her mascara was not smeared. Her expression was not crumpled, but the quiet, corrosive kind of crying that happens in small, locked rooms when a person is forced into an encounter with a version of themselves they hadn't expected to meet. Her eyes were slightly swollen. Her color was off. She had clearly been in that lavatory for the last 15 minutes, which was where Carla had directed her after the captain's order came through to remove her from active service. She was making her way now to the rear of the plane. The aisle was the only route available to her. She had to walk through the section where James was sitting. The cabin tracked her. Not rudely, not with the pointed stares of a crowd enjoying someone's humiliation, but with the involuntary attention of people who have witnessed something significant and cannot quite make themselves look away from its aftermath. Gloria Hutchins looked up from her notebook. Phil, who had been almost asleep, opened his eyes. Derek Okafor across the aisle did not reach for his phone. Rebecca walked without looking at anyone. Her chin was not up the way it had been an hour ago. She was not performing anything. She was simply moving through the only space available to her head, slightly down, holding the seat backs along the way, because her hands needed something to do. She stopped when she reached row 24. James did not turn his head. He was aware of her presence the way he was aware of most things in a cabin, peripherally precisely, and he let her stand there for a moment before he acknowledged her, because she was the one who had stopped, and if she had something to say, she could begin. "Mr. Wilson." Her voice was different. All the edge had left it. What remained was something much smaller and much more human. I know there's nothing I can say that—" She stopped, started again. "I wanted you to know that what I did was wrong. I know that doesn't change anything." James turned his head and looked at her. He took in her face, which was the face of a woman who had in the last hour been introduced to the full consequence of a moment she could not take back. He had been here before on the other side of an apology that came too late to be anything other than a documentation of damage. "I hear you," he said. She waited as if there might be more. There wasn't. She moved on to the rear of the aircraft, and James heard behind him the sound of the last row's seat being lowered, and then nothing. Phil let out a breath that he had apparently been holding. "Man," he said softly. Gloria Hutchins wrote something in her notebook and underlined it twice. The flight continued south of Chicago, bending northwest over the great flat plains of the upper Midwest, and the conversation in the cabin gradually found a new lower register, the background hum of people who have shared an unusual experience and are still metabolizing it. Somewhere over Minnesota, Carla came through with a second round of beverage service, and life performed the small miracle it always performs, which is that it continued. But James felt it coming before it arrived. He had been waiting for it in the way that you wait for the second shoe when you've already heard the first. His instincts, his training, the particular antenna that had been tuned to frequency over 20 years of sitting in exactly these kinds of seats, on exactly these kinds of planes, all of it was pointing at something that hadn't happened yet. He didn't have to wait long. Carla appeared at his row again, and this time she wasn't carrying water. "Marshal Wilson," she kept her voice low. Her face was carefully composed in the way that faces are when they are working to not reflect whatever they are feeling. "The captain has asked me to let you know he's just received communication from Atlanta operations. The airline's senior VP of customer experience is on a call with legal right now, and there are some developments with the media." James looked at her steadily. "What kind of developments?" Carla glanced just briefly at Phil, who was making a very committed show of looking out the window. Then she looked back at James. "There's a video," she said, "on social media. It's been shared approximately 40,000 times in the last 20 minutes. James absorbed this without visible reaction, though his mind ran the full calculation instantly. 40,000 shares in 20 minutes meant velocity. It meant the clip had hit a nerve and been picked up by at least one account with significant reach. It meant that by the time Flight 557 touched down in Seattle, there would be cameras, not just airline security and law enforcement. Cameras. "Which platform?" he asked. "Multiple from what the captain said. It started on one and cross-posted." "What does the video show?" "The badge. And—" Carla hesitated. "And her face when she saw it. Someone was recording from the moment you identified yourself." Derek Okafor across the aisle was looking very fixedly at the seatback screen in front of him. James filed that away. "Tell the captain I understand," James said, "and tell him I'd like to speak with him again in the last hour of the flight before we start our descent." "Of course," Carla said. She moved away. Phil could no longer sustain the pretense of window gazing. He turned to James with the expression of a man who had just understood that he was not simply on a flight where something interesting had happened, but on a flight that was in a very concrete sense becoming news. 40,000 shares, Phil said. He said it the way people say things that they are still processing. That's a lot. It is, James agreed. So people know, like outside the plane people already know. Sounds like it. Phil was quiet for a moment. Then, is this going to be a thing? Like a big thing? James thought about Captain Morrison calculating the weight of 14 years of service against the weight of a federal charge. He thought about Rebecca Walsh in the back of the plane, sitting in the silence she had made for herself. He thought about Anthony and Simone Carter and baby Elijah and the diaper bag that had started all of this, which was right now sitting secure in an overhead bin 4 rows forward, as if nothing had happened. He thought about Maya's 17 voice messages. Yes, he said. It's going to be a thing. Phil nodded slowly with the solemnity of a man who has just received confirmation that his instincts were right, which is one of the most satisfying and most disquieting feelings available to human beings. Huh, he said. The plane banked slightly northward, adjusting course, and the overhead announcement tone chimed once the polite, meaningless chime that means nothing in particular, and in the back of the aircraft in the last row, Rebecca Walsh sat with her hands in her lap and her phone face down on the tray in front of her, because she had turned it face down 20 minutes ago when the notifications had started coming in, and she had not turned it back over since. She already knew what was on it. She had known since the moment Carla had walked past her with a look that was precisely, carefully, professionally blank, which was itself a kind of message that Rebecca had spent 14 years in this industry learning to read. She knew what blank meant when it came from someone who was holding something back. She had used that face herself on passengers in situations that now seemed from this distance very different than they had felt at the time. She sat in the last row with her hands in her lap, and through the small oval window beside her, America was arranged below in its vast, indifferent geometry fields and roads, and the occasional cluster of something that might be a town, and she understood with the slow, irreversible clarity of someone who has finally stopped negotiating with the truth that the life she had known as of this morning no longer existed. It had ended somewhere over the American heartland at cruising altitude in the space of 1.5 seconds, and the plane flew on. The video had a title by the time it hit 200,000 views. Someone had clipped the footage, added a text overlay in bold white letters against the original shaky cabin footage, and the title read, "Flight Attendant Slaps Black Federal Marshal. Watch what happens next." It was not a subtle title. It was not designed to be. It was designed to be clicked and it was being clicked at a rate that the social media platforms themselves were beginning to flag as accelerated distribution, which was the clinical way of saying that what Derek Okafor had recorded in seat 21C at 37,000 feet was now traveling faster than the plane that contained him. Derek knew this because he had somewhere over South Dakota given into the impulse he had been resisting since the moment Carla mentioned 40,000 shares and opened his phone. He found the clip within seconds. He recognized his own shaky framing immediately, the slight tilt to the left, the partial obstruction of the seat back in row 22, the audio that was surprisingly clear considering the ambient engine noise. He watched James Wilson open the credential wallet. He watched Rebecca Walsh's face. He watched the cabin hold its breath. He put his phone face down on his tray. Then he picked it up again and watched it one more time. 212,000 views. In the time it had taken him to put the phone down and pick it up again, 12,000 more people had watched the moment that Derek had lived in real time. He thought about that the way an experience that felt private and contained and specific to the 60-odd people in coach on a specific aircraft had become in under an hour the property of an audience he would never meet and could not imagine. He thought about Rebecca Walsh in the last row. He thought about whether he should feel responsible for any of this. He thought about Anthony Carter holding his infant son and saying please, and being told that the baby was not the flight attendant's concern. He put the phone in his pocket and did not take it out again. James, for his part, had decided to stop calculating the share count and focus on the things he could actually control, of which there were at 37,000 feet, with 2 hours remaining in the flight, a limited but important number. He could control his documentation. He could control his communications with Captain Morrison. He could control the statement he would need to give probably within 40 minutes of landing to whatever combination of law enforcement and federal personnel would be waiting at the gate. What he could not control, and had made his peace with not controlling, was the fact that his face was now on the internet in a context he had not chosen, doing a thing he had not planned to do on a day he had mostly wanted to spend listening to his daughter's voice messages. The thought of Maya's voice messages produced for the first time since the slap something that felt genuinely like emotion rather than operational processing. He pushed it down. Not away down, which was different. Down meant he could reach it later. Away meant it was gone, and James Wilson had spent enough of his career pushing things away to know that away was a lie. He was still sitting with this when Carla appeared at his row for the third time, and this time her face was not composed at all. "Marshal Wilson," she said, and her voice had a new quality in it, the tightly controlled quality of someone who is about to say something that they know is going to change the shape of the next hour. "I need you to come to the rear galley, right now." James was up before she finished the sentence. He followed her down the aisle, and he was aware as he moved that the cabin was tracking him again, that collective unconscious attention that had developed on this flight, like a weather pattern, always oriented toward wherever the next pressure was building. He did not look back. He kept his eyes on Carla's shoulder blades and followed her to the narrow space behind the last row of seats where the galley equipment was stacked and the light was slightly different, and there was just enough room for two people to stand close and speak without being heard by the passengers. What he found when he got there was not only Carla. Rebecca Walsh was standing in the galley space, and beside her, with the particular stillness of someone who has just been told something that required every available resource to absorb without collapsing, was another flight attendant, a man, slightly built name tag reading Thomas, who had been working first class and whom James had not interacted with during the incident. Thomas was looking at Rebecca with an expression that was not sympathy and not judgment, but the complicated middle space that exists between those two things when you know someone well enough to care about what happens to them and are watching them make it worse. "What's happening?" James asked. Carla looked at Rebecca. Rebecca, after a moment, looked at James. "My phone," Rebecca said. "I turned it face down because I knew there would be messages from the video, but I just checked it." She stopped, steadied. "My daughter called. She's 17. She saw the video at school. Someone showed it to her during lunch." James said nothing. "She called me 7 times, Rebecca said. 7 times in a row, and I missed every one of them because my phone was face down. And then she left a voicemail that... Rebecca's composure, which had been holding by increasingly narrow margins since the lavatory, chose this moment to give way slightly, not dramatically, but with the particular crack of something that has been under sustained pressure for too long. She said she was embarrassed. She said her friends were asking her why her mother... Rebecca pressed her lips together. Why her mother had hit a black man on a plane. The galley was very quiet. Thomas put one hand on Rebecca's shoulder briefly, then removed it. James looked at Rebecca Walsh, and he thought about a 17-year-old girl sitting in a school cafeteria with her mother's face on somebody's phone screen, and he thought about the gap between who we believe we are and who our behavior when visible reveals us to be. He thought about how the most devastating reckonings are rarely the official ones. The firings, the charges, the investigations, those were survivable in the sense that they were external and defined and had timelines and endpoints. It was the phone call from the 17-year-old that would follow Rebecca Walsh into every quiet room for the rest of her life. He did not say this. It wasn't his to say. "Is there something you need from me right now?" he asked. She shook her head. Then she said, "I just needed..." "Carla said I should tell you that it was already out there, that you should be prepared." "I appreciate that," James said. He meant it. He went back to his seat. Phil had somehow acquired a second bag of pretzels and was eating them with the focused attention of a man who is using food to process a large amount of incoming information. He looked up when James settled back in. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the pretzels. He looked back at James. "You okay?" Phil asked. It was... James reflected a surprisingly direct question from a man who had spent most of the flight at the edge of inappropriately timed curiosity, and it landed differently because of that. Genuine concern had a specific weight, and Phil's question had it. "I'm all right," James said. "Thank you for asking." Phil nodded and returned to the pretzels. This was James decided the correct response. This was Phil functioning at his very best. The first major external development arrived approximately 40 minutes after that, and it arrived through Captain Morrison's voice on the PA system, which meant every person on the aircraft received it simultaneously, which meant the cabin's collective processing happened in real time, and James was present for all of it. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I'm updating you on our current situation. We are approximately 90 minutes from Seattle, Tacoma, and I want to be transparent with you about what you can expect when we arrive. Law enforcement personnel will be meeting our flight at the gate. I want to be clear that the vast majority of you are not involved in any official capacity, and deplaning will proceed in an orderly fashion. However, I need to ask that any passenger who directly witnessed the incident in the main cabin earlier be prepared to briefly provide your contact information to airline staff before departing. This is voluntary, but it would assist the official investigation. Additionally..." Morrison paused in the way that trained voices pause when the next sentence is the one that changes everything. "I've been informed by our operations center that there is media presence forming at the airport. I want to prepare you for that possibility." The pause after the PA clicked off lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then the cabin detonated. Not violently. This was not chaos. It was the specific high-energy eruption of 214 people processing the word media simultaneously and arriving at slightly different speeds at the same understanding they were no longer simply passengers on a delayed and unusual flight. They were witnesses. They were going to be walked off a plane and into cameras. Phil, to his credit, did not say anything for a full 30 seconds. He appeared to be genuinely working through the implications. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its eager edge and replaced it with something more careful. "Media presence," he said. "He said media presence." "He did," James confirmed. "Like news cameras." "Probably." Phil set down the pretzels. "Huh," he said. Gloria Hutchins, who had now filled 4 pages of her notebook and had switched to a secondary pen, when the first ran low, looked up at the PA speaker as if it had said something she wanted to ask a follow-up question about. Then she returned to writing. Her handwriting, James had noticed when he'd passed her row earlier, was the precise, confident cursive of someone who had spent decades writing things that needed to be read by other people. She would be, he suspected, an excellent witness. The Carter family. Anthony, Simone, and Elijah, who was asleep against his mother's shoulder with the absolute indifference of the very young to human consequence, had gone quiet. Anthony was leaning slightly forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at nothing in particular, which was the posture of a man doing serious thinking. Simone had her free hand over his on the armrest. James watched this for a moment and then looked away. The next thing that happened arrived not from the front of the aircraft, but from a woman in row 19 named Patricia Holt, who was 63 years old and had retired from a 27-year career as a paralegal with a firm in Atlanta that had specialized in civil rights litigation, and who had therefore been watching the entire sequence of events on this flight with a professional framework that most of her fellow passengers lacked. Patricia Holt leaned across her empty middle seat. She had an exit row, a stroke of luck she was now very grateful for, and addressed James directly, in a voice that was quiet, precise, and carried the specific confidence of someone who knows what they're talking about. "Marshal Wilson," she said. James looked at her. "I've been taking notes since the incident. I have a clear sight line from my seat to where the contact occurred, and I saw everything from the moment you approached the family through the moment you displayed your identification. I want you to know that I'm prepared to provide a full, written statement to whatever investigative authority has jurisdiction over this matter." And she reached into her bag and produced a business card, slightly worn but legible, from her former firm. "I have contacts in federal civil rights law who will want to hear about this if you determine that's a direction worth pursuing." James accepted the card. "I appreciate that, Ms. Holt." "Patricia," she said, "and I want you to know something else." She paused, as people do when they have held something for a while and are only now deciding to release it. "I've watched a lot of incidents in my career, depositions, testimonies, records of what happened versus what institutions said happened. You handled this with more restraint and more professionalism than I have seen most people manage in situations that had a lot less pressure in them. I wanted to say that directly." James held her gaze. "Thank you," he said. He said it the way a person says thank you when they mean it beyond what the word can contain. Patricia nodded, once the precise, dignified nod of someone who has delivered what they came to deliver, and returned to her own notes. Phil had watched this entire exchange with an expression of slightly awed attentiveness. After Patricia turned away, he leaned toward James and said, just above a whisper, "Is she a lawyer?" "Retired paralegal sounds like," James said. "She seems like she could be a lawyer." "She does," James agreed. The plane entered what felt like a calmer register after that, the way storms sometimes produce a temporary quiet at their center, though everyone on board understood that the calm was geographical rather than genuine. They were moving through it, not past it. Seattle was still 70 minutes away. The media presence was still assembling itself at the airport, with the efficient, purposeful energy of a story that had found its legs and was running. James excused himself and made his way to the forward lavatory. He needed 2 minutes of a space where nobody was watching him, and the 8 square feet of a commercial airplane lavatory was the only available option. He locked the door. He ran cold water over his wrists. He looked at himself in the narrow mirror at the left side of his face, where the impact had landed, where there was no mark visible because Rebecca Walsh had not hit him hard enough to leave one. That was its own particular irony. The evidence of what had happened existed entirely in the recollections of the people who had witnessed it, and on a phone screen somewhere, but on his face, which was where the act had been committed, there was nothing. He thought about what that meant, about how much of the time that was exactly the way it worked, the damage landing in places that didn't show the proof sitting in other people's memories, the burden of making something real that left no visible mark. He dried his hands. He unlocked the door. And standing in the narrow aisle just outside the lavatory, waiting with the patient, grounded posture of a man who had decided exactly what he wanted to say and was simply waiting for the opportunity to say, it was Anthony Carter. Elijah was in a carrier against his chest, asleep, his small face tucked sideways against his father's collarbone. Anthony looked at James with an expression that had none of the complicated layers that James had read in it earlier. It was simpler now. Resolved. "I needed to say something to you," Anthony said. "All right," James said. "When she was talking to us, to Simone and me before you came over, the way she was talking to us." Anthony stopped, not because he had lost his thought, but because he was choosing the exact right weight for each word. "I've been talked to that way before. I'm sure you know what I mean. And I had my son in my arms, and I was doing the math the way you do, figuring out how much I could push back, how much it would cost me, what it would look like, whether being right was worth what it might set in motion. You know that math?" "I know that math," James said. "And you didn't do any of that math. You just stood up and helped us." Anthony's jaw tightened briefly. "I need you to know that I saw that we both saw it, that it mattered." James looked at this young man holding his sleeping son in the narrow aisle of a commercial aircraft somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, and he felt something unlock in his chest that he hadn't known was locked. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like recognition, the feeling of being seen by someone who had the specific equipment to do the seeing. "I have a daughter," James said, 12 years old. "I've been trying to get home to her." Anthony nodded. He understood the entire sentence, including the parts James hadn't said. "Fly safe," Anthony said. "Already started," James said. Anthony moved back toward his row. James stood in the aisle for a moment. Then Carla's voice came from the front of the cabin, calm, but with an underlying urgency that cut straight through the background noise. "Marshal Wilson, the captain needs you on the radio." James moved. He was halfway up the aisle when he saw it. The thing he had not expected. The thing that recalibrated every assumption he had built about how this would land when they reached Seattle. Through the window of row 12, which he passed on his way forward, a passenger had her phone pressed close to the glass and was reading something off the screen with wide, still eyes. The passenger behind her was doing the same thing. The passenger across the aisle was leaning forward to see what they were seeing. James stopped. The woman in row 12 looked up at him. She was maybe 65, silver-haired, wearing reading glasses pushed up on her head. "It's on the news," she said. It was not a question. She was telling him. Her voice had a quality in it that took him a moment to identify. When he did, it surprised him. It was not excitement. It was not the satisfied electricity of people who like to watch things burn. It was gravity. She said it the way people say things that they understand the weight of. "It's on the national news." James looked at her phone. He did not need to read more than 2 lines of the headline. He continued forward. The cockpit door was already opening as he approached it, and Captain Morrison was leaning out with a look on his face that confirmed what James had already understood: the story had left the plane. It had left the plane in a way that no amount of careful PA language or internal airline protocol could contain or redirect. Somewhere in a television studio on the ground, an anchor was introducing footage. Somewhere a chyron was being written. Somewhere the people who made decisions about Rebecca Walsh's future at Monarch Airlines were in a room together having a conversation that was no longer primarily about what had happened on a flight. It was about what was happening on a screen. "Marshal Wilson." Morrison's voice was tight. "Monarch's general counsel is on a secure line. They want to speak with you before we land." James stepped into the cockpit. The radio crackled, and everything that happened next happened faster than any of them were ready for. The voice on the other end of the radio was not what James had expected. He had anticipated legal, the clipped, precisely calibrated language of a corporate attorney managing exposure, choosing every syllable the way a surgeon chooses an instrument. What he got instead was something closer to controlled panic, wearing a legal vocabulary like a borrowed coat. "Marshal Wilson, my name is Richard Calloway. I'm General Counsel for Monarch Airlines. I want to begin by saying that the airline takes this incident with the utmost seriousness and—" "Mr. Calloway," James said. His voice was the same voice he had used in the cabin. Quiet, level, in possession of itself. "I'm going to stop you there because I want to be clear about something before this conversation goes any further. I'm not a complainant you're managing. I'm a federal officer who was assaulted in the performance of my duty on your aircraft. That means this conversation is happening between you and the United States Department of Homeland Security, not between you and a dissatisfied passenger. Do you understand the distinction?" A pause, brief but dense. "Yes, Marshal, I understand." "Good. Then let's talk about what I actually need from you." Captain Morrison was standing to James's left, close enough to hear both sides without leaning in. His expression had the quality of a man watching a chess match between two people significantly better at chess than he was, not confused exactly, but alert to the fact that the moves being made were more sophisticated than they appeared. James outlined his requirements with the efficiency of someone who had given versions of this briefing before. He needed Monarch's complete incident documentation from the flight, every note Carla had made, every communication Morrison had sent or received, the aircraft's own logging of the PA announcements. He needed the airline's full employment record for Rebecca Walsh, including any previous complaints, incidents, or disciplinary actions. He needed confirmation that Walsh had been formally removed from duty and that this removal was documented in terms that could not later be recharacterized as voluntary or temporary. And he needed the airline to understand in language that left no room for reinterpretation that any attempt to settle this matter privately, quietly, or in ways that obscured what had actually occurred would not be received well by the federal entities that would be involved in this investigation. Calloway was quiet for longer this time. Then, "Marshal Wilson, I want to be transparent with you. Your airline's position, James said, is going to be shaped significantly by what happens in the next 40 minutes before this plane lands. I would encourage you to think carefully about what shape you want it to be." Another pause. Then Calloway said something that James had not expected. He said, "There have been previous complaints." Morrison turned his head. "Against Walsh?" James asked. "3 formal complaints in the past 4 years, 2 from passengers, 1 citing aggressive behavior, 1 citing the language used was discriminatory treatment. 1 internal complaint from a junior crew member. All 3 were reviewed and closed without disciplinary action." James absorbed this. He absorbed it fully, the way you absorb something that confirms what you already suspected and is worse for the confirmation. 3 complaints, reviewed and closed. He thought about what reviewed and closed meant. In the architecture of institutional accountability, the meetings where someone decided that the cost of action was higher than the cost of inaction, where precedent and paperwork and the particular frictionlessness of doing nothing combined to produce an outcome that remained invisible until the day it landed on a federal officer's face at 37,000 feet and ended up on national television. "You're going to want to have that documentation ready," James said. "All 3 complaints, everything attached to them. Every email, every review, every decision. The investigators are going to want it." "I understand," Calloway said. His voice had changed. The controlled panic had drained out of it and left something more honest, the particular exhaustion of a person who knows that the thing they were hoping to avoid has arrived in full. "One more thing," James said. "The Carter family, seat 21A through C, a young couple and an infant. They were the family directly involved in the initial interaction. I'd like the airline to reach out to them directly tonight with a formal apology and whatever support the airline deems appropriate. Not because I'm asking you to manage them, because it's the right thing to do, and you should have already thought of it." A pause. "That will be done, Marshal." James handed the radio receiver back to Morrison and stepped out of the cockpit. Dana Kim's voice followed him into the aisle. 41 minutes to touchdown, Marshal." He nodded without turning back. The cabin had changed again in the way that cabins change when the energy inside them has been building for too long and has begun to find outlets. People were on their phones in the open now, no longer the discreet, angled-away posture of earlier, but the direct, engaged posture of people who had decided that the social contract about public phone use no longer applied to this particular flight, or perhaps that the story they were sitting inside was significant enough to outweigh the usual courtesies. The glow of screens was visible in peripheral vision up and down the rows. James did not need to look at any of them to know what they were reading. Patricia Holt. When James passed her row, looked up from her own phone with an expression that had sharpened considerably since their earlier conversation. "The stories on 4 major networks," she said without preamble. "CNN, NBC, ABC, and Fox are all running it. The framing is different on each one, which is going to be interesting to watch. But all 4 of them are running it. I appreciate the update," James said. "There's something else." She held up her phone. On the screen was a social media post from an account with a blue verification checkmark, a civil rights organization based in Washington, D.C., one that James knew by name and reputation. The post read, "We are aware of the incident aboard Monarch Airlines Flight 557 and are monitoring the situation closely. We stand with Marshal Wilson and call on Monarch Airlines to provide a full public accounting." They posted that 11 minutes ago. They have 2.3 million followers. James looked at the phone. He looked at Patricia. "How long have you been tracking all of this?" She allowed herself a small, precise smile. "Since the PA announcement about media presence. I have colleagues. I made some calls." James looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, Patricia." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Wait until you see what the airline says at the press conference." He continued to his seat. Phil was not eating pretzels anymore. Phil was sitting with both hands flat on his tray table and the expression of a man who has been on a very unusual flight and is beginning to understand that the unusual flight is not the most unusual thing that is happening, that the most unusual thing is the speed at which the world outside the plane is moving toward them. He looked at James with a directness that had replaced the earlier eager curiosity. Something about the last hour had settled Phil into a more serious register. "I called my wife," Phil said. "From the Wi-Fi. She'd already seen the video. She'd been watching it for 40 minutes. She didn't know I was on this plane." He paused. "She cried." James said nothing, but he was listening. "She said, my wife, she said that she hoped you were okay, and she wanted me to tell you that if I got a chance." Phil looked slightly embarrassed, the way men sometimes do when they relay sentiment that feels too large for the container of an airplane conversation with a stranger. "So, she hopes you're okay." James looked at Phil at the sales rep from Columbus with his Notre Dame sweatshirt and his pretzels and his instinct toward conversation that had somewhere over the past 3 hours moved from intrusive to human, and he felt a warmth toward him that surprised him with its specificity. "Tell her thank you," James said, "and that I am." Phil nodded. He looked relieved, as if he had been carrying the message and was glad to have delivered it. 22 minutes to landing. The descent announcement came, and with it the mechanical adjustments of the aircraft, the change in engine pitch, the shift in cabin pressure, the attendant sounds of a large machine beginning the long, careful negotiation with gravity that would eventually return it to Earth. The seatbelt sign came on. Around James, people stowed devices and returned seats to upright positions with the automatic compliance of experienced travelers. And for a few minutes the ordinary rhythms of flight arrival asserted themselves over everything else, and it almost felt normal. Then the door at the rear of the aircraft opened, and Rebecca Walsh walked up the aisle. She was not supposed to be there. She had been directed to remain in the rear of the aircraft for the duration of the flight. James registered this immediately, registered the irregularity of her presence, the break from the protocol that had been established, and his body went to a particular kind of alert that was not alarm, but was something adjacent to it. He watched her come up the aisle. She was not walking with purpose exactly. She was walking the way people walk when they have made a decision that they know is probably not wise, and have made it anyway because the alternative, sitting with their hands in their lap for 22 more minutes, has become genuinely impossible. She stopped at row 21. She stopped at the Carters. Simone Carter saw her first. James watched Simone's body language shift, a slight pulling inward, an instinctive tightening, the physical expression of a person who has had enough of a specific interaction and is bracing for more of it. Anthony looked up. Elijah was awake now, sitting alert in his carrier, looking at Rebecca with the uncomplicated curiosity of an infant who has not yet learned to read the air in a room. Rebecca stood in the aisle. She was not composed. She was not delivering anything rehearsed. What she was, James could see from 3 rows back, was simply a woman who had run out of the ability to sit alone with herself and had made the only move available. "I owe you an apology," Rebecca said. Her voice was low enough that James had to focus to catch it. "Both of you. The way I spoke to you, the way I treated your family, that was wrong. It was disrespectful, and it was cruel, and it was wrong." Anthony Carter looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing the thing James had watched it do throughout this flight, running a careful private calculation between what he felt and what he chose to show. When he spoke, his voice was steady and unhurried. "Why?" he said. Rebecca blinked. "I'm sorry." "Why did you do it?" Anthony asked. "Not the apology, I hear you, but why did you treat us that way? I want to understand if you know." The question landed in the surrounding rows like a stone in a pond, and James watched the rings expand. Phil beside him had gone completely still. Patricia Holt had looked up from her phone. Gloria Hutchins had her pen suspended above her notebook. Rebecca was quiet for long enough that it was clear she was not going to give a prepared answer, because she didn't have one. What she gave instead was something messier and more honest. I've been asking myself that. For the last 3 hours, I've been asking myself that. And I don't have a clean answer. I had a bad day, and I took it out on people who didn't deserve it, and I made assumptions about— She stopped. About people that I shouldn't have made, and I can't undo any of it. I can just tell you that I know it was wrong. Anthony looked at her for another long moment. Simone had not spoken. Elijah grabbed at the air with one small fist, reaching for something only he could see. "I appreciate you saying it," Anthony said. "I'm not going to tell you it's okay, because it's not okay, but I appreciate that you said it." Rebecca nodded. She looked at Simone. Simone met her eyes briefly, then looked back at Elijah. It was not forgiveness. It was not dismissal. It was the measured, dignified response of a woman who knew exactly what she was owed and had decided how much of herself she was going to spend in this moment. Rebecca turned and walked back down the aisle. James watched her go. He thought about the 17 voice messages on his phone, and about the daughter who had called her mother 7 times and heard nothing, and about the complicated human machinery of consequences and reckonings, and the specific unscripted moments when people find out who they are under pressure. He thought about all of it, and he let himself feel the full weight of it for about 4 seconds. Then he looked out the window. The city was below them. The Pacific Northwest, green and gray and enormous, spreading out under a sky that was doing what Seattle skies do in the early evening, holding all its light in reserve, sharing it in pieces. He could see the water. He could see the roads. Somewhere down there was Maya's school, Maya's room, Maya's phone containing 17 voice messages addressed to him. 12 minutes. Carla came through the cabin for the final time, doing the last walkthrough before landing, and when she reached James, she paused for just a moment. "Thank you," she said very quietly without stopping, "for how you handled all of it." "You did your job well today," James said. She moved on. The plane broke through the lower cloud layer, and Seattle-Tacoma International Airport resolved itself below them with the specificity of a place that was no longer abstract, and James could see even from this altitude that the area around the gate was not ordinary. There were vehicles that were not airport vehicles. There was a concentration of people and activity near the terminal that had the particular unmistakable shape of an official response in progress. He had been in enough operational arrivals to read the geography of it, the staging, the positioning, the deliberate organization of a scene that was expecting something. They were ready for this plane. The wheels touched down with the familiar controlled force of a proper landing, and the cabin produced its automatic collective exhale, that small, unconscious expression of relief that passes through airplane passengers at the moment of touchdown, regardless of what else is happening, because landing is landing, and the body knows it. Around James, people reached for phones and laptops, and the particular energy of arrival reasserted itself. For 30 seconds, Flight 557 was simply a plane that had landed. Then the PA crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Local time is 6:47 p.m. Before we deplane, I need to ask for your patience and your cooperation. Law enforcement personnel will be boarding the aircraft before passenger deplaning begins. I need all passengers to remain seated until you are given clearance to exit. Marshal Wilson, if you would please make your way to the forward door." James stood. The cabin watched him, all of it. Phil, Gloria, Patricia, Derek, the couple in row 7, the man who had been reading a paperback thriller since Atlanta and had barely looked up at anything, the silver-haired woman who had shown him the phone screen. All of them watched him stand and move forward through the aisle for the last time. It was a walk that felt to several of the people watching it like something they would remember longer than they expected to. James passed Anthony Carter's row. Anthony was standing. He had gotten up to retrieve something from the overhead bin, and they were face to face for a moment in the aisle, the kind of close proximity that a narrow airplane aisle forces on people, and Anthony extended his hand. James shook it. One hand, firm, complete. "Get home to your daughter," Anthony said. James nodded. "Take care of your family." He moved forward. He reached the forward door as it unsealed from the outside, and the first person through it was a man in a dark suit with a federal credential visible on his belt, mid-40s broad, with the specific bearing of someone who had been in field operations long enough that the bearing had become structural. He looked at James and extended his hand. "Special Agent Marcus Webb, FBI Seattle Field Office." His handshake was brief and certain. "We've been briefed. 3 King County officers are behind me, and TSA supervisory staff are securing the jet bridge. Are you ready?" "Ready," James said. "We've also got a situation you need to be aware of before we step off this aircraft." Webb's voice dropped slightly, not enough that it was inaudible to Carla, who was standing 3 feet away, but enough to signal that this was a shift in register. "In the last hour, 2 additional Monarch Airlines employees have come forward. Former employees. Both filed complaints that were dismissed, one in 2021, one in 2022. Both are alleging that the dismissals were improper. Both have retained legal representation." James held Webb's gaze. "Against Walsh or against the airline?" "Both." There it was. The thing that General Counsel Calloway had not quite told him, but had implied with the weight of someone who was aware that the floor beneath his feet had already begun to give. 3 internal complaints closed without action, and now within an hour of the story going national, 2 of the people connected to those complaints had found each other, or found lawyers, or found the courage that a camera and 100,000 shares can sometimes provide to people who have been waiting for the moment when their account of things would finally be believed. James thought about institutions, about the specific patient erosion that happens inside them when accountability is repeatedly deferred. The way each closed complaint becomes a precedent, becomes a permission, becomes a floor for the next behavior, and the next, and the next. Until one day a flight attendant raises her hand at 37,000 feet without a moment's hesitation, because nothing in her experience has ever suggested that this would cost her anything at all. He thought about all the flights before this one, all the passengers, all the families with diaper bags and infants and luggage that didn't quite fit being spoken to in tones that nobody challenged because nobody felt they could. "Are you ready to make a statement?" Webb asked. "Yes," James said. "It's going to be significant. Media presence outside is, I'll be honest with you, Marshal, it's substantial." "I've been told." Webb nodded. He stepped aside and gestured toward the jet bridge. The King County officers fell into position. Carla, behind James, said something in a low voice to Thomas, who had come forward from first class. The sounds of the aircraft settling around them, the engine wind down, the equipment sounds, the particular quiet of a plane that has arrived and is now simply an object on the ground continued beneath all of it. James took one breath. He thought about Maya. He thought about how she would listen to this story eventually. Not the version on the news, not the version in whatever legal filings would follow, but the version he would tell her himself, sitting across from her at whatever kitchen table they ended up at, the version that included Phil and Gloria and Patricia and Anthony and baby Elijah and the overhead bin and the 31 hours without sleep and the 7 missed calls from a 17-year-old girl that her mother had not answered. He thought about the version of this story that was already being assembled outside this aircraft by people with cameras and microphones, and about the version that actually happened, and about the gap between those two things, which was where the real accounting always lived. He stepped through the forward door of Monarch Airlines Flight 557 and into the jet bridge, and the door closed behind him, and ahead of him were the lights and the noise and the full, uncontainable consequence of a moment that had lasted 1.5 seconds and would take much, much longer to resolve. He walked toward it without breaking stride. James had walked jet bridges in 17 countries in airports that ranged from gleaming to barely functional, in conditions that ranged from routine to the kind that required him to keep one hand free and his head on a continuous swivel. He had never felt one quite like this, the particular compressed energy of a space that was simultaneously a corridor and a threshold, the place between what had happened and what was about to happen next. Special Agent Webb walked beside him. 2 King County officers followed. Ahead, the muffled noise of the terminal was already audible, a pressure building behind a wall, and James understood with the instincts of a man who had spent his career reading the shape of situations before he walked into them, that the moment he stepped through the door at the end of this bridge, everything would accelerate. He was right. The terminal erupted, not with chaos. There was a perimeter. TSA and airport security had done their job. The physical space was controlled, but with the specific, overwhelming noise of a large number of cameras and a large number of people who had been waiting and who had just seen what they had been waiting for. James walked into it without stopping. He had been coached once early in his career by a supervisor who had been through a high-profile incident, and the advice had been simple and had turned out to be the most useful professional guidance he had ever received. When you walk into cameras, pick a direction and keep moving. Because the moment you pause, the image becomes a question, and you want it to be a statement. He kept moving. Webb steered him left through the perimeter, past the cluster of reporters calling out questions that layered on top of each other into something that was more sound than language. Past the airport staff standing with the uncertain stillness of people who have been told to be present but not told what to do, and through a side door that led into a restricted corridor where the noise dropped by 2/3 immediately, and James could hear himself think again. Waiting in the corridor were 4 people. 2 he recognized by their bearing as Federal Department of Homeland Security, he suspected, or possibly Justice. One was a woman in a Monarch Airlines executive blazer, with the particular expression of someone who had been on a phone call for the last 2 hours and had not enjoyed any portion of it. And one was a man James did not recognize at first, a man in his 60s with close-cropped white hair and a suit that had not come off a rack, who was standing slightly apart from the others, with his hands clasped in front of him, and his eyes fixed on James with an attention that was different from everyone else's in the corridor. The man extended his hand before James had fully processed who he was. "Marshal Wilson. I'm Deputy Director Alan Garfield, Homeland Security. I flew in from D.C. 2 hours ago." He paused to let that land. "When I say we are taking this seriously, I want you to understand that my being in this corridor is what that looks like." James shook his hand. "I appreciate it, sir." "Don't appreciate it yet. We've got work to do." Garfield turned to Webb. "Give us 2 minutes." Webb nodded and moved the King County officers down the corridor. Garfield looked at James with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who had spent 40 years in federal service and had stopped performing seriousness because he no longer needed to. "I've read the preliminary report. I've seen the video. I've spoken with General Counsel Calloway at Monarch, who I want you to know spent approximately 40% of that conversation emphasizing how cooperative the airline intends to be, which tells you everything you need to know about how frightened they are." He paused. "I also need to tell you something that is not in any report, because it happened in the last hour." James waited. Rebecca Walsh's union filed an emergency motion 40 minutes ago, arguing that her removal from duty was procedurally improper and requesting reinstatement pending formal review. Garfield's voice was flat informational, but James caught the thing underneath it, the particular tightness of a man who has spent his career watching institutions protect themselves and has not yet stopped being angry about it. The union's position is that she was not given adequate opportunity to respond to the allegations before being removed. James stared at him. "She was caught on video." "Yes, she was. 40,000, 200,000, however many shares later, she was caught on video. And the union's position is that she didn't have enough time to respond to the allegations." "That is their position." Garfield held his gaze. "It will not succeed. I want to be clear about that. But I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from someone else, because I want you to understand that the next 72 hours are going to include people and institutions attempting to slow walk, reframe, and gradually reduce the significance of what happened on that aircraft, and I want you to be prepared for that." James absorbed this. He thought about the 3 closed complaints. He thought about reviewed and closed. He thought about the specific practiced patience required of a system that protects itself by treating each incident as isolated, each complaint as a data point rather than a pattern, each consequence as negotiable. He thought about how Rebecca Walsh had struck him without hesitation, without calculation, without a single visible moment of doubt. And he thought about what it takes to build that kind of certainty in a person, what years of institutional protection must feel like when it calculates itself into the body, into the reflexes, into the raised hand. "The union's motion won't succeed," James said, "but it will slow things down. Possibly by days, not by more than that. And the criminal charge. King County Prosecutor's Office is filing assault on a federal officer. That is not negotiable, and it is not slowing down." Garfield said it with a finality that closed that particular door completely. "What I need from you right now is a full, formal statement. Tonight. And then I need you to be prepared for a press briefing tomorrow morning. The department will have someone with you." "I'll do the briefing myself," James said. Garfield looked at him for a moment. "That's your choice to make." "It is," James said. "And I want to make something else clear, sir. The criminal charge is important. But what I actually want, what I'm going to say tomorrow, and what I'm going to keep saying, is that Walsh didn't create this situation alone. 3 complaints, reviewed and closed. That's a system that made her possible, and the system needs to answer for that along with the individual." Something shifted in Garfield's expression. Not surprise. Something more like alignment, the look of a man who had been hoping someone would say the exact thing that was just said. "The department shares that position, Marshal, fully." He extended his hand again. James shook it. "Let's get you through the statement," Garfield said, "and then let's get you home." The formal statement took 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was conducted in a room that smelled like commercial carpet and recycled air, with a federal stenographer and 2 DHS investigators and Special Agent Webb, who turned out to be a careful and methodical interviewer who asked good questions and did not ask them twice. James went through the sequence from the moment he boarded the aircraft in Atlanta to the moment he stepped off the jet bridge in Seattle, and he did it with the precision that 20 years of operational reporting had built into him, specific, sequential, neither embellished nor minimized. He included every word he could recall from his exchanges with Rebecca Walsh. He included the 3 seconds of stillness after the slap and what he had decided in those 3 seconds and why. He included the cockpit conversation with Morrison and the radio call with Calloway and what Calloway had disclosed about the previous complaints. When he was finished, the lead investigator, a woman named Agent Sue Park, who had said very little during the statement and had written continuously, looked up from her notes. "Marshal Wilson, I have one question that isn't in my standard protocol, but I'd like to ask it with your permission." "Go ahead," James said. "In your 20 years, have you experienced incidents of this nature before, in which the circumstances involved both your identity as a black man and your status as a federal officer? And if so, how does this incident compare?" The room was very quiet. James looked at Park for a moment. He thought about what the question was asking and what a careful professional answer would look like, and whether this was a moment for a careful professional answer. "Yes," he said, "multiple times. The difference this time is the camera." Park held his gaze. "And without the camera, James said, "I write the incident report, file it through channels, and we see what the airline decides to do with it, which based on their track record with previous complaints, I think we both understand." Park wrote something. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the formal portion of the evening concluded, and Webb walked James out through a secondary exit toward a waiting vehicle. The main terminal, visible through the glass of a connecting corridor, had thinned from its earlier intensity, but had not returned to normal. Clusters of reporters were still positioned near the gate area, and James could see, even at this distance, the particular readiness of people who intended to be here for however long this took. His phone had 237 unread notifications. He had not looked at a single one since landing. He looked at them now briefly, long enough to confirm that they were mostly what he expected. News alerts, messages from colleagues, several from his supervisor at the Air Marshal Service, who had left 3 escalatingly urgent voicemails that James would return tomorrow, and one text from a number he didn't immediately recognize that turned out when he read it to be from Captain Roy Morrison. The text said, "You handled yourself with more class than this situation deserved. For what it's worth, I've put that in writing in my own report." Safe travels, Marshal. James put his phone in his pocket. Webb stopped him at the exit. We have a hotel arranged for tonight, department's covering it. There'll be a car for you tomorrow morning for the press briefing. Is there anything you need tonight? James thought about this. He thought about the hotel room and the quiet of it, and the particular isolation that follows a day of sustained, high-stakes visibility, the way the body craves stillness after that kind of exposure, and the way the mind paradoxically refuses to provide it. I need to make a phone call, James said. Of course, Webb said. He stepped away to give him space. James dialed Maya. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she had been awake and waiting, which told him everything he needed to know about what kind of day she had had on her end of this story. Dad. Her voice was the voice he had been carrying in his chest for 11 days in Qatar, and 3 hours on a flight that had turned into something much larger than a flight. 12 years old, and already her voice had the particular quality of someone who understood more than they let on. Hey, Maya Bird, he said. He had not called her that in front of another person in years. He didn't care that Webb was 30 feet away. I saw it, she said. I saw the video, like 3 hours ago. Aunt Diane called me because she saw it first and she wanted to tell me before I saw it from someone at school, but Jasmine had already texted me, so... A breath. Are you okay? Like actually okay. Actually okay, James said. I promise. She hit you. She did. And you just stood there. You didn't... Maya stopped. When she came back, her voice had something in it that he recognized as the particular emotion of someone who is proud and frightened simultaneously, which was not a simple thing to feel at 12 years old and not a simple thing to express. You were so calm, Dad. Why were you so calm? James thought about how to answer this. He thought about the 3 seconds of stillness and what he had decided in them, and about the choice between who you are and what you feel, and about the discipline of keeping those two things correctly ordered, even when the distance between them is at its widest. Because calm was the most powerful thing I could be in that moment, he said, and I knew it. Maya was quiet for a moment. I have 17 voice messages for you. I know. I'm listening to all of them tonight. Even the one where I spent like 6 minutes explaining why my social studies teacher is wrong about the Electoral College, especially that one. She laughed. It was the laugh he had been carrying with him for 11 days in Qatar, and hearing it in real time from the actual source was something he could not have described to another person if they had asked him to. Come home, Maya said. Tomorrow, he said. I promise. Tomorrow. He ended the call and stood in the secondary exit corridor for a moment by himself and let the silence of it settle over him like something solid. The day had been 38 hours long. The slap had lasted 1.5 seconds. Everything in between had been a reckoning that was not finished and would not be finished for a long time. He was ready for it. The press briefing the following morning was held in a DHS conference room on the 3rd floor of a federal building 4 miles from the airport, and it was attended by more cameras and more journalists than James had been told to expect, which meant the story had not slowed overnight, but had instead done what certain stories do, had found its second wind, accumulated more layers, generated the kind of follow-on reporting that brings in new voices and new angles, and makes the original event larger in retrospect than it appeared in real time. 3 things had happened overnight that James learned from Garfield over coffee before the briefing began. First, the union's emergency motion had been denied at 11 p.m. by a federal magistrate who, according to the legal summary Garfield read from his phone, had used the phrase demonstrably inadequate procedural basis in her denial, which was judicial language for not even close. Second, 2 more former Monarch employees had come forward by morning, a 3rd flight attendant who alleged she had filed a complaint against Walsh in 2019 that was closed without investigation, and a gate agent who alleged he had witnessed Walsh speaking to a black passenger in a way he described as openly degrading and had reported it to his supervisor who had told him to let it go. That made 5 documented prior complaints against 1 employee, all dismissed, all now part of the public record. Third, the National Air Marshal Association had released a statement at 7 a.m. calling the incident a clear and documented example of the dangers faced by federal officers who operate in plain clothes and calling on Congress to review the protocols governing the treatment of undercover federal personnel in commercial aviation settings. James read the association statement twice. He had not expected it, and the specificity of it, the way it connected his individual experience to a systemic policy question, was exactly the direction he had wanted this to go. He walked into the briefing. He stood at the podium and he looked at the cameras and the journalists and the DHS officials flanking him, and he thought about 37,000 feet and a diaper bag and a sleeping baby and 1.5 seconds, and then he spoke. He spoke for 14 minutes. He was clear. He was specific. He was controlled, but not flat. He allowed himself the particular kind of controlled emotion that is not performance, but is simply the honest presence of a person who has been through something real and is not pretending otherwise. He described what had happened in sequence and without inflation. He named the 3-second choice he had made and why he had made it. He said directly, and without softening, that the criminal charge against Rebecca Walsh was warranted and appropriate, and that he supported it fully. And then he said the thing he had told Garfield, the night before the thing that had been building in him since the moment Calloway said 3 complaints reviewed and closed. He said that Rebecca Walsh did not exist in a vacuum. He said that she was the product of a system that had encountered evidence of her behavior 5 times across 6 years, and had chosen on 5 separate occasions to close those complaints without consequence, and that a person who is never held accountable for small harms will inevitably commit a larger one, and that the responsibility for the larger harm belongs not only to the individual who commits it, but to the institution that built the floor beneath her. He said that he was calling on Monarch Airlines to conduct a full independent audit of its complaint review processes. He said he was calling on the Federal Aviation Administration to review its standards for investigating passenger complaints against crew members. He said he was calling on Congress to provide federal air marshals operating in plain clothes with clearer, more explicit protections under the law, not because his badge should matter more than any other passenger's right to dignity, but because what happened to him had been happening to passengers who did not have badges and would keep happening as long as the system that enabled it remained unchanged. He finished speaking. The room held for exactly 2 seconds. Then every hand went up at once. He spent the next 40 minutes answering questions, and he answered them the way he did everything with precision, without evasion, and with the particular patience of a man who understood that saying the right thing once was less effective than saying it clearly enough that it could not be misunderstood. When it was over, Garfield walked him out through a side entrance to the waiting car, and they stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the particular brightness of a Pacific Northwest morning that had decided to be sunny, which Seattle mornings occasionally do, with the confidence of exceptions that know they are exceptions. "You did well in there," Garfield said. "I said what needed to be said," James replied. "Those are occasionally the same thing." Garfield extended his hand for the 3rd time in less than 24 hours. "The department is behind you, Marshal. Every step of what comes next." James shook his hand and got in the car. The weeks that followed moved with the particular combination of speed and slowness that major institutional reckonings always involve: fast in public, slow in the machinery. Rebecca Walsh was formally charged with assault of a federal officer, a charge that carried up to 8 years of federal prison time, and which her attorney, in a statement released 48 hours after the briefing, said she intended to contest, though the tone of the statement had the specific quality of language composed by someone who already knew how this ended and was managing the timeline rather than the outcome. She was terminated by Monarch Airlines the same day the charge was filed in a termination letter that the airline's PR department simultaneously released to the press, and which James noted when he read it, used the phrase "deeply inconsistent with our values" in a way that would have been more convincing if the airline's complaint review board had operated with any visible awareness of those values for the preceding 6 years. The FAA review was announced 4 weeks later. The independent audit at Monarch was announced 3 days after that, following a shareholder meeting at which the incident had been raised by 6 separate investors. Congress scheduled a hearing. Patricia Holt testified at it, as did Gloria Hutchins, whose notebook turned out to contain the most precise contemporaneous record of events that any investigator had seen, and who delivered her testimony with the composed, deliberate authority of a woman who had spent 32 years in classrooms making sure that the truth once spoken was heard correctly. Anthony and Simone Carter were contacted by Monarch Airlines the night of the landing as James had requested. The airline offered them a full refund, a travel voucher, and a formal written apology. Anthony accepted the apology. He declined the travel voucher. In an interview he gave to a journalist 2 weeks later, he said that what he wanted was not compensation, that what he wanted was to be able to put his son on a plane someday without doing the math. The interview was read by a lot of people. It was quoted in the congressional hearing 3 times. Derek Okafor gave the original video footage to federal investigators and subsequently declined all media requests for comment, which he explained to friends by saying simply that he had recorded what happened and that the record should speak for itself and that he was done adding to it. This was a more mature position than most 29-year-olds would have taken, and he knew it, but he had been raised by parents who understood the difference between witnessing and performing, and he honored that distinction. James Wilson flew home to see Maya on the day he had promised the day after the briefing. She was waiting at the door when the car pulled up, which she would have been embarrassed about if any of her school friends had been present, but none of them were. So she stood there without apology and watched her father walk up the path with his go-bag over one shoulder and the particular exhaustion of the week visible in him, and it didn't matter because he was here and he was home. He sat at the kitchen table and he listened to all 17 voice messages in order while she sat across from him eating cereal and watching his face. And when he got to number 11, the one where she spent 6 minutes explaining why her social studies teacher was wrong about the Electoral College, he started laughing and couldn't fully stop for a while. And Maya said, "See, I told you," and he said, "You are completely right." And she said, "I know." And they sat together in the kitchen while the morning moved around them. He thought about what she had asked him the night of the landing. "Why were you so calm, Dad?" And he thought about the answer he had given her, which was true, but which was also only part of the truth. The fuller truth was that calm for James Wilson was not the absence of feeling. It was the decision to let feeling exist without letting it make the decisions. It was the practice of a lifetime built in the specific conditions of being a black man in America who had chosen a career in federal law enforcement, who had navigated the daily arithmetic of visibility and invisibility of being underestimated and over-policed and doubted and dismissed, and who had made the choice over and over in small moments and large ones to be the clearest, most precise version of himself regardless of how the room was reading him. It was not a superhuman quality, it was a human one. It was the quality that got built in people who never had the option of not needing it. 6 months after Monarch Airlines Flight 557 landed in Seattle, the FAA published new guidance governing the complaint review process for commercial airline crew conduct. The language was specific, the timelines mandatory, the oversight external. The guidance cited the incident on Flight 557 twice by name. It would take years to fully implement and longer to fully enforce, and it would be imperfect as all institutional reform is imperfect. And James Wilson knew this and accepted it without cynicism because he understood the difference between the work being complete and the work being started. And this was the work being started. On the day the guidance was published, Maya texted him a screenshot of the news article with a single line, "You did that." He texted back, "We did that." She sent him 17 eye-roll emojis, which was her way of saying she understood completely. 1.5 seconds had started something that the people in power had spent 6 years deciding was too small to matter. James Wilson had stood in that 1.5 seconds and refused to make it smaller, and in doing so, had made it large enough to matter for everyone who came after him. Every family with a diaper bag, every passenger doing the math in the aisle, every person on every flight who deserved to be spoken to like a human being, and had been waiting without knowing it for someone to establish once, and clearly that they were right to expect it. That was the accounting. That was the reckoning. That was what 37,000 feet above America had produced when one man chose calm over silence and stayed standing.